Welcome to the Ethical Schools podcast. I'm Amy Halpern-Laff.
And I'm John Moscow. For this special video episode, we've collaborated with Dr. Meira Levinson of the EdEthics project at the Harvard Graduate School of Education.
This is the first in a series of episodes featuring normative case studies exploring dilemmas in schools. As Dr. Levinson describes in her book, Dilemmas of Educational Ethics, normative case studies are richly described, realistic accounts of complex ethical dilemmas that arise within practice or policy contexts. Each of these case studies focuses on a particular decision point in which the right course of action is unclear. The cases help diverse groups of people discuss challenging ethical questions in nuanced and inclusive ways.
Today we're exploring the case study, Taking the Action Out of Civics, written by Sarah O'Brien and Meira Levinson. The case takes place in a high school social studies department, which receives pushback after introducing a project-based civics curriculum commonly known as Action Civics. The first part of this video presents the case narrative, performed by a talented group of actors. Immediately following the case narrative, Dr. Levinson will discuss the case with a diverse group of thinkers. In this discussion, they explore the ethical dilemmas in the case, along with the competing values and policy considerations that make the right course of action so difficult to determine.
We hope the case and the conversation highlight many important and challenging questions related to civic education, parental rights, teacher autonomy, and youth agency. And now, here's the case video.
Even after 20 years of teaching, the first day of school was still exciting for Emily Wilson, Social Studies Department Chair at Central High School. The school year wouldn't start for students until next week, but staff were back on campus for meetings. Emily opened her email. Scrolling through her messages, she read, "Have you seen this?" The email linked to an opinion piece from the local newspaper, written by John Warner, parent of a rising Central junior.
Kids once went to school to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic. Not anymore. Central High School now requires Action Civics, better described as protest civics. In their history classes, students learn to stage walkouts and protests directed by left-wing educators who use teenagers' temper tantrums for their own political ends. It's indoctrination, and I refuse to stand for it.
Emily felt the attack keenly. She imagined defending the program to Mr. Warner.
I introduced the Action Civics model to Central myself last year. It was a big success at my old school, and I'm excited that all Central juniors participate. In Action Civics, students examine their community and identify issues that need solving. They choose which issue to focus on. They do research about their chosen issue and look at the systems that contribute to presenting problem. With school and community partners, they plan some action to create change. It could be organizing a protest, but it could also be creating a public service announcement or making a presentation to the principal or the school board. And students constantly reflect on what they're learning about the government, about community, and about themselves. Sure, the process doesn't always run smoothly. I know we got some pushback, as you note, Mr. Warner, disagreements happen about the root causes of problems or which action to take. And of course, the students don't always create change. But these challenges make Action Civics valuable. Students see different viewpoints and see the issues in more complex ways. They gain public speaking skills and learn to navigate spaces of power. I remember one student told me, "This project taught me that I shouldn't be afraid to stand up for what I think is right. It taught me that anyone has the ability to affect change, no matter who they are." What else do you have to say, Mr. Warner?
Parents must band together to fight this indoctrination. The next school board meeting is 2 weeks from tomorrow. Join me for a conference this Saturday at the New Hope Presbyterian Church, organized by local groups that share my concerns as we plan to make our message heard. I am the tip of the sword. There are many others behind me.
The subject came up quickly at the department meeting that morning.
We need to talk about this. Across the country, Action Civics is being lumped in with a host of so-called controversial theories that parents are up in arms about. We can't just ignore this article and hope that protesters won't show up at the school board meeting. For all we know, there will be news cameras with them.
I actually think the article makes some decent points. You might remember that I expressed doubts about Action Civics this time last year. These projects take time away from learning real history.
I remember your doubts, Jim. But your students really enjoyed the project, right?
Sure, yeah. All kids enjoy working with their friends and leaving school to visit city council. But we're in a crisis of civic ignorance. Only half of Americans can name all three branches of government. I've been teaching civics longer than anyone here, and trust me, it's not the right time to be experimenting with civics education.
Those statistics show that the traditional curriculum doesn't work well, and we know it particularly doesn't work well for kids who are like me. Action Civics is good for all kids, but especially for Black kids, for Latino kids, and for other kids from marginalized groups. Action Civics help them see themselves in curriculum. They get to focus on problems that feel relevant for them and their families.
But not all those families support Action Civics. One of the stories in the article came from my class. One group was doing a project to raise awareness of income inequality, and we had a discussion about whether meritocracy is a myth. A Black mother called me the next day, furious, because she felt I had told her son that however hard he worked, he'd never succeed the way white people did. She said he felt like he'd always be a victim. I managed to reestablish a good relationship with the student and the mother, but it was painful for all of us. I mean, who am I to tell a Black family I know more about racism than they do? As a brand new teacher, too.
I remember that, Caitlin. But you know that mom doesn't speak for all Black families. Class discussions like this are valuable.
Look, Action Civics causes problems between parents and kids, too, not just parents and teachers. I had one student last year, incredible athlete, looking at the controversy around transgender kids playing sports. Her parents are religious and don't support transgender rights. The girl was so worried she'd get into trouble at home that she switched groups to work on a pro-life project. But before she switched, she spent days in a panic. Kids shouldn't be tackling these issues, riling everyone up and stressing themselves out.
The problem isn't the issues. The problem is the pushback.
Yeah, well, more pushback is coming, assuming we keep the project. I'd certainly support dropping it.
Thoughts swirled in Emily's head as she walked back to her office. But any decision about the Action Civics project didn't ultimately rest with her. Rhonda Williams, curriculum coordinator for the district, would make the final call. So Emily forwarded Mr. Warner's opinion piece to Rhonda, asking about the discussion at the district office. A knock at the door from Principal Dan Ritchie interrupted her work.
I'm guessing that you saw John Warner's opinion piece?
I did. I know we got some pushback last year, but I honestly wasn't expecting anything like this.
I've heard complaints from Mr. Warner before. A few years ago, he objected to a book with a same-sex kiss. Of course, it was a different world back then. Nowadays, you see security escorting protesters from school board meetings, or even arresting people. And Mr. Warner didn't try to pull in other parents that time, not that I remember.
I was surprised by how many of the parent complaints we got last year were in his piece.
The whole city's more polarized than ever. My wife's on the city council, and she says their meetings get pretty heated. I don't even want to imagine our school board meetings, or any city meetings, filled with protesters shouting and news cameras everywhere. It's a real safety threat.
I don't want to imagine that either.
Maybe there's some way to make these projects less political. Maybe some approved topics for students to choose from, topics that aren't so controversial.
That would undermine a key purpose of Action Civics. Students choose issues that matter to them, and many of those issues are political.
Maybe changing what students are allowed to do. They could write letters to the editor or have a class debate.
That takes the action out of Action Civics. Action Civics empowers students in a way that those traditional activities don't. They get to choose how they present their message.
I understand. But a lot of parents don't want their empowered children learning to plan walkouts. Those parents deserve a say in their children's education. Besides, you know we've been dealing with budget cuts. The last thing the superintendent wants is a costly lawsuit from angry parents. Central is different from your old school, Emily. I just don't think we're ready for something as divisive as Action Civics here.
An hour later, Diane Johnson appeared in the doorway.
Was that Dan I saw in here a while ago?
Yes. I'm sure you can guess why he came. Yesterday, I thought the Action Civics project was a key part of the American history curriculum. Now I have parents, teachers, and administrators telling me otherwise.
You've also got parents and teachers telling you differently. Check out the Central Parents Facebook page.
Mr. Warner certainly has plenty of supporters. Listen to this. Kids need to learn before they become activists, so they have informed opinions.
Well, you also are focusing on the wrong parts. There are parents who support Action Civics like this too. Like my son hated history for years, but his project changed all that. Now he wants to intern at the State House. I just wish he'd done the project years ago.
But listen to this. Maybe the school board isn't the right place to fight. We should talk to our state representatives. Some places have already banned Action Civics. What if we become the school that inspires a new law here banning Action Civics for the whole state? There are well-funded groups behind parents like Mr. Warner. They could make a lot of noise in the Capitol.
It's a risk we have to take. I've seen this too often here. We do something that challenges the status quo and people get nervous. And suddenly we don't teach that book or do that project anymore. We decide to wait until people feel ready. We've made a lot of statements about equity and justice recently, but I don't see those statements turning into action. We have a chance to stand for equity here.
Can I come in?
Of course. We're just talking about the Action Civics project.
That's why I came. I want to drop the project this year. I'm not eligible for tenure until next year, and I'm worried my contract won't be renewed if anything goes wrong in my classes. But maybe you could still do it in your classes?
We'll talk more about it at our one-on-one meeting.
Katie nodded and headed out the door.
I imagine Rhonda won't want just some classes doing Action Civics. Curricular alignment matters to the district.
Besides, Katie teaches 3 general ed sections. We don't want Action Civics to become something only AP kids do.
True. I have to see what they're thinking at the district office. It's a lot to consider.
After Diane left, Emily woke up her computer to find a response from Rhonda.
I did see that article. I've been fielding a lot of questions at the office about Action Civics. The press attention definitely has some people nervous here, so we'll have to decide how far we push this issue. There may be some rebranding we can do to placate the dissenters. And of course, Action Civics isn't the only way to shake up the curriculum. The money we have budgeted for the project could fund a guest speaker maybe, or a new field trip. It's something to think about. Come by the office this afternoon to let me know where you stand.
Where do I stand? Should I push to keep Action Civics unchanged in the curriculum and risk a firestorm of protests and press coverage? Should I just accept that the timing isn't right at Central? Is there some middle ground, a way to keep some core of Action Civics while softening the more controversial pieces? What will I tell Rhonda this afternoon?
Welcome. I am super excited to have just an outstanding panel here to talk about our normative case study, Taking the Action Out of Civics. We have 4 really exciting conversationalists with us today. Debbie Haleko is an 8th grade social studies teacher at North Olmsted Middle School in Ohio, where she engages students in project-based learning as they investigate local issues. In 2019, her students gained national attention when their research and advocacy ultimately led to the town placing a new memorial marker on the unmarked graves of 2 Black families who died in the 1800s. Former journalist and teacher Robert Pendicio is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. His writing focuses on literacy, curriculum, civic education, and classroom practice, and has appeared in publications like The Atlantic and The Wall Street Journal. In 2019, he published the book, How the Other Half Learns: Equality, Excellence, and the Battle Over School Choice. Andrew Wilkes is the Chief Policy and Advocacy Officer at Generation Citizen, a nonprofit that works to help young people understand and exercise their civic power through civics education. His work at Generation Citizen focuses on building coalitions and leading policy initiatives. He has extensive experience as a community organizer and an advocate for social change. And then my colleague, Fernando Reimers, is a professor of international education and director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. His research focuses on understanding how to educate children and youth so they can thrive in the 21st century. He is a member of UNESCO's Commission on the Futures of Education, which wrote the recently published report, Reimagining Our Futures Together, a New Social Contract for Education. And he has written or edited 43 books. And I realized I failed to introduce myself. I'm Meira Levinson. I teach at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And I am hosting this, guest hosting this series, and am really excited to lead this conversation about taking the action out of civics. To start with, I'm going to ask actually each of you to get us going. And why don't we start with Andrew, and then Debbie, and then Robert, and then Fernando, to tell us, what do you think some of the key dilemmas are in this case, and for whom? And just sort of operationally, for us to be on the same page, in this case, we're thinking of a dilemma as a situation where there's no one right answer, and where it's hard or even impossible to realize all important values and principles at once. So Andrew, do you mind kicking us off?
A few dilemmas in particular stand out for me. One is for Emily, the social studies department chair, who appears to be in the position of trying to determine whether to retain some version of Action Civics, whether to discontinue it or redefine it, rebrand it. So a continuum of decisions there. I think there's also a dilemma for Diane, who is wondering about the viewpoint diversity of how parents are represented in terms of how they think about Action Civics. And there's a department meeting conversation in particular where, in the case, you see some contestation there. But then also, thirdly, a dilemma that stood out is Rhonda, the social studies coordinator at the district, in terms of how to engage community members around Action Civics. So not only the classroom issue, but a community dilemma as well.
Also, there's the dilemma of Katie, the newer teacher who is worried. She seems to be interested in the project, but she's worried about her job. And that's a real worry in light of the types of teacher evaluations that are happening. And I know in our state, Ohio, they've done away with tenure. They've done away with longevity as protection for your job. So everything is dependent on how you are evaluated. So Katie is very worried about that. Even though she would probably like to participate, she's somewhat concerned about what could happen to her in her personal life. Dan, the school principal, appears to be interested in the project and sees its value, but is trying to figure out a way to maybe make it less controversial, which by doing that probably also lessens the value of the activity. So those are the ones that stood out for me.
In watching the video, I was struck by how much I felt like I did not know about the vignette. In other words, I wanted more context on the school, on the kids, on their level of preparation, on their civic education more broadly. I mean, maybe we can talk about this later on in the conversation, but having taught at a school where civic education was at the core of the K-12 curriculum, that colors my perception of the particulars of Action Civics. So that was just the big question in my mind. Is this a one-off, or where did the Action Civics fall within the larger context of their K-12 education and their civic education level of preparedness in general?
So I totally understand you wanting to know these things. Can you say how different answers to those might change your understanding of what the dilemmas are that are at stake?
Oh, no, absolutely. Because for several years, I taught the senior seminar in American history to the senior class at Democracy Prep, which is a charter school or network of charter schools based in Harlem, New York. I also mentored each year students' so-called Change the World project, which was, we didn't call it Action Civics, but it was. It was a year-long capstone project where kids would take on an issue that they chose themselves that they were passionate about, and they would spend a year basically in preparation to do some form of activism around that issue. And my perception of Action Civics was very colored by that experience because I taught a senior seminar that was really almost like constitutional law in a sense. And the capstone project of that class was to have them write a policy brief. This was just my own evaluation of what we were doing in the school. I felt like the civic education program was very, very heavy on the activism. And since my background is, journalism and policy, I wanted them to see that there's other levers that they can pull to create change in the world. So the final project in my class was to take what you learned in your year-long capstone Change the World project and write a policy brief seeking to change some kind of government policy, practice, funding, procedure, etc. And frankly, there's no reason not to be candid about this. I was just stunned at their level, their lack of preparation to translate that thinking from one to the other. So while I'm not, by any means opposed to Action Civics, I felt like there was just a tremendous blind spot that had gone missing for a very long time. And I don't want to be unkind, but I felt as if we were preparing them merely to march in other people's armies, so to speak. In other words, if you were not prepared, I can tell the story briefly of one student who organized a protest, a die-in front of the local police precinct to protest police violence. Very moving, a bit of activism. When I challenged him to translate, okay, well, what would you want the NYPD to do differently? He really struggled mightily with it, to the level of not really being sure where to aim his policy brief. It's the local level, state level, federal level. It's the NYPD. That should be rather obvious, right? So it was just kind of, it became clear to me over time that we were really kind of narrow casting in a sense. So if I'm defending Action Civics, I want to be able to contextualize it within the student's broad a suite of civic skills, motivations, etc. If this is the only thing they're doing, then I'm going to be on the side of some of the people, frankly, who are criticizing Action Civics. In other words, it's almost impossible for me to view this case study as a one-off. It really has to be within the larger suite of skills, level of preparation for me to be able to defend it or criticize it.
So tell me if this is right, and then Fernando, I want to get to you. In some ways, depending on what else is going on in the school, you see a dilemma for Jim, who is emphasizing students, his feeling that students lack basic civic knowledge. He has a dilemma for how to convince his colleagues to take him seriously about this. And not just to reject him as being like a knee-jerk.
Yes. It's a complicated issue. If this is the only thing that kids are doing in civic education in this school, well, then I'm Team Jim, right? In other words, it would then feel like indoctrination. Or at least I would have a hard time critiquing his critique that this is indoctrination. If it's within the larger suite of civic skills and genuine knowledge, then it's richer. Then it really is an exercise in cultivating student agency. It is not just, as I said earlier, preparing kids to march in someone else's army about things that they have maybe a visceral feeling for, but not a deep understanding of. So where I'm going to fall along that spectrum really depends on the level of knowledge that they're bringing to their project, as opposed to. And if it's not doing that, then you're frankly vulnerable to the arguments that Jim is making.
Okay, great, thanks. Fernando, what dilemmas do you see in this case for him?
So I agree with Debbie and Robert that there are a range of dilemmas in the case, but I do think they're organized in a hierarchy, in that one of them is anchor. And depending on how that one is resolved, that conditions the other dilemmas. And to me, the anchor dilemma is the dilemma that Emily Wilson, the chair of social studies, faces, because she has to decide what to do with this op-ed, how to respond. And to do that, the first thing she needs to do is to interpret what this op-ed means. And so now, in addition, that op-ed has open controversy within the department and in the school more generally as to whether to continue. Now, what contributes to the dilemma for Emily, I think, is that she doesn't know the intent of the parent, right? Is he committed to democratic dialogue? And is his op-ed just a way to open up democratic dialogue? Or is he engaged in oppositional tactics where no matter how Emily responds, he's going to try to steamroll opposition to that? So to me, that's the anchor dilemma. That's where she is. And I think part of the dilemma for her is she going to respond to these autonomously as a professional, or is she going to pass the buck to the principal? That's a decision she needs to make. She could lay these on the lap of the principal, or she could say, no, I am a professional here, and this is my dilemma to resolve, and stand by that, which, could cause a lot of heat for her within the school.
Yeah, I want to just add that I understood the study as the Action Civics was part of what they would do and not the whole of what they would do in the civics class. And so if it's part of it, then I think some of those issues would kind of work themselves out because you could still be teaching the traditional civics curriculum. And as far as indoctrination goes, my thinking on indoctrination is they have a choice of the topic. And so I'm not sure how that could be considered indoctrination. And if teachers had the ability to indoctrinate their students, I think we would be indoctrinating them on things like the importance of being on time and having your things and being attentive in class and things that are important to us as teachers. And we don't have that ability. And so that would be my argument to the parent group is they have a choice and these are things that are important to them and they're applying their knowledge that they're learning in their civics class.
Let me take up the issue of indoctrination and kind of unpack that word a little bit. And this kind of bolsters my point about, well, what's the entire suite of civic education, knowledge, skills, activities that they're learning. Some years ago, I gave a talk to the Shanker Institute about this, and I made what I thought was an uncontroversial notion that one of the Achilles heels of Action Civics is what I described as the lack of gratitude inherent in it. In other words, as a teacher, as a civic educator, I want, or I would say that we need both. You need kids who have a sense of gratitude, a sense of optimism, a sense of, yes, patriotism, because if their civic education dwells exclusively in the bad and the broken, what needs to be fixed, well, then that's presenting, that's problematic on a number of levels. One, that's where the indoctrination creeps in, or the idea of indoctrination creeps in, because if you're the parent, you say, listen, all my kid is ever learning about or ever doing is learning about how terrible things are. Where is the room for optimism? Where is the room for gratitude? At a moral level, I would argue you have to love something before you're motivated to fix it. So we might fall into the perverse trap of actually creating a sense of enervation as opposed to a sense of agency. If all kids are ever dwelling in is what's the problems that they're facing, if they don't feel a sense of agency, of bought-inness to their community, to their country, etc., then that could be overwhelming, I think, after a while. So I think it's not indoctrination. You're teaching my kid to feel X. They're just not getting exposure to ideas that would let them feel like powerful people who are invested in change, as opposed to everything is broken and I'm overwhelmed by it.
Can I actually invite Andrew in on this point? Because Andrew, you had brought up the dilemma for Diane and thinking about viewpoint diversity. And in some ways, I'm struck and like listening to this conversation that we're sort of taking like an omniscient perspective of this. And I think you were really helpful in initially introducing the idea that there may be multiple perspectives here.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts come to mind. First, I think Diane points to the differential experiences of students in the classroom with respect to how the curriculum is experienced, but also in talking about how the experience of one parent may not be representative of all parents. And the op-ed that was written by a particularly spirited and vocal member of our civic committee may not represent all folks' views. And I think a part of that the actual I'd say maybe gratitude and conversation with Robert that Action Civics provides is the give and take of debate and students engaging in deliberative democracy about issues that they select, where they can weigh evidence, where they can talk about whether it's writing a policy brief, whether it's in the case of what we see in a lot of Generation Citizen classrooms, students are picking issues like mental health rather than some of the hot button issues that are often discussed. And so I think when we consider the question of viewpoint diversity and how to manage difference conversationally, that's a skill that happens in the classroom and that I think the case gestures towards that's as useful in the workplace as it is in the public square.
Thanks, Andrew. That actually moves us on, I think, really, really well to the next question I want to ask you all, because I think there's this question about why so many people are being pulled in so many different directions, and also like why we have these different interpretations of where, say, the core dilemma is in the case. So partly I hear that there may just be different interpretations of what happens when a kid engages in action civics, right? Do they, in fact, learn concrete stuff about how government works, what constitutes effective civic action? Do they think about questions of policy? Or do they just get pulled into sort of, again, what the teacher, Jim, derides as, having fun, going off and like being with their friends to testify, right? Like how much learning takes place and what kind of learning takes place. There's also, Fernando is bringing up, and actually you brought this up also, Andrew, at the beginning, the political questions. And Debbie, you brought this up, the political question for Katie, the new teacher who's concerned about being fired. There are various questions that each of these educators themselves is wrestling with kind of as a civic actor. What can I expect of the other civic actors I'm, interacting with? And like, how do I engage in my own sort of power analysis and civic interpretation in order to figure out how to navigate the various forces at play in order either to achieve what I know I want to achieve, like keeping my job, or perhaps, keeping action civics in the curriculum, or to learn from others, right? Because I think there's also some people who are like questioning, well, what should be done? Say like Dan, the principal, who, and potentially Rhonda, who's like, well, it seems good. Like, I liked it, but aren't there other things we could do, like field trips, right? Like, so I'm curious, as you look at these dilemmas for the various people you've identified, do you see these as stemming from different people holding different values? Or do you see these as stemming from people holding the same values, interpreting them in different ways? Or maybe they're like agreed on what their aims are, but they just have different views about how we get there. Fernando, you were just shaking your head. So do you want to start us off here?
Yeah, yes, because I think that there are dilemmas that stem from different values, but also dilemmas that stem from different beliefs. And my sense is that dilemmas that stem from beliefs are easier to solve through democratic dialogue than dilemmas that stem from values. I'm going to argue that these dilemmas are, on the surface, mostly about beliefs. Perhaps one is about values. So what are the dilemmas? What are the differences in beliefs? One, disagreement about the value of experiential learning versus the intellectualist approach to learning civics. So the intellectualist approach assumes that conceptual knowledge eventually leads to procedural knowledge. The experiential approach is John Dewey saying, no, The only way you actually learn is reflecting from experience. And people have honest different views on that. But there is also an evidence base that we can use to inform those beliefs. The second difference in belief, I think, comes on disagreement about the value of engaging students in discussions of controversial topics, on which there is also evidence that can inform that belief. And there is a nice footnote that cites work that says, look, if people were exposed to the evidence, you could bring them closer in terms of their beliefs. The third difference in beliefs is perhaps lack of knowledge of what action civics is when it's confused with indoctrination. Because I went to the website of the organization, and to the best of my knowledge, what this is doing is engaging students in deliberation and decision making, negotiating decision making. This is the opposite of indoctrination. And I don't get the sense that anyone is telling the students, what movement they should join, but it's actually engaging them in deciding what to do. And if that is true, there's no way you can call that indoctrination, but there may be a different knowledge base about what this thing actually is. And the last one, which may be a borderline between differences in beliefs and values, is perhaps disagreement about, you remember Joel Wertheimer's thesis of the kind of citizen, right? The personally responsible citizen, the participatory citizen, and I think he called them social justice, kind of the transformational citizen. So that may be a difference in belief, but it could also be in values. Maybe there are differences here in what people think civics should do. If you believe that what you should do is educate people who are personally responsible, you may be less inclined to an approach that is about getting people to question norms and rules and try to change them. So, because I think this is mostly about beliefs, I am hopeful that democratic dialogue itself can help resolve this issue. If I thought this was exclusively about value based beliefs, then I would either be less hopeful or accept that it's going to take a long time to resolve these things.
I think this is definitely about beliefs and values. I think there's also a dynamic of power and influence that's not reducible to questions of belief and influence, which comes to mind in a couple of instances from the case. One is that there's an op-ed from Mr. Warner, which is kind of generating and initiating this, is broadly reflective of what the op-ed project might note as a certain maybe overrepresentation of some citizens arguing and getting their views in state papers of record relative to others. And so there's a kind of uneven level of voice among citizens that I think initiates the conversation. But the second question of power, and I think you rose really good frame, Fernando, in talking about the anchor dilemma. I think there's probably two rather than one anchor dilemmas. One is what Emily decides to do, but then there's also a question of to what degree does Emily feel she can influence Dan, the principal, and to what degree does Emily feel that Rhonda can be influenced? And those are questions of deliberation, which in some regards mirror what's happening in the classroom. And so I think there's an ecosystem approach of what happens in the classroom, what happens between teachers and principals, and then what happens between particular schools and districts, which is equally important to highlight in the case because it has everything to do with the experience that students ultimately have.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a belief thing, and it's definitely a misunderstanding on the part of the parent group as to what this actually involves. Because even in the case, there was a student who switched from doing something about transgender athletes to a right to life kind of thing. So not all the issues are traditionally left wing type issues, and because the kids choose them. And so I think if the parents understand exactly what's happening, they're going to be less resistant to whatever their children are doing. In my personal case, now I teach 8th grade, so what we were doing was not called Action Civics, but like Robert said, it kind of was what it ended up being. And those 8th graders ended up, because they were trying to tie in local history with the American history they were learning, they discovered an old map and they saw that there were unmarked graves and that it was handwritten. It just said colored people buried here, and they were outraged and they wanted to do something about it. And before, like, I kind of stepped back and they're like, we want to call the mayor. We want to call the mayor. They called the mayor. They got the mayor to come out to our school, and the mayor was asking them, well, what do you want? And they said, we'd like a sign up there at least acknowledging these families because this is wrong. And so the mayor was prepared to do some kind of a sign, and then they were invited to the Landmarks Commission meeting. And so these kids were attending meetings and speaking out, and they were kids that didn't typically speak out in class, and they got very, very excited about it. And in the end, a company that makes headstones agreed to actually donate one, and they got that put in. So they felt very empowered. And that's the kind of thing that, so they did see how local government works. You go through the mayor, you go through the Landmarks Commission, you do these different things. And I think it was a valuable lesson for them. And they felt like, wow. And I know the one girl said, if an 8th grader can make change, maybe anybody can. So that was, to me as a teacher, that really felt good.
So before we turn to you, Robert, I'm curious, Debbie, two things. How political did that activity feel? Political, I guess, maybe meaning on a partisan level. Like, were there people or parents or community members who you feared might actually be concerned about what your kids were doing and pushing back? Was there a landowner who might have been involved, et cetera? And then my second question is, given what you were saying at the beginning about like how you thought if the parents understood, then they wouldn't be upset. Do you think this is just a communications problem by Emily? Like if Emily had been more active about, proactive about communicating, do you think that Mr. Walsh would not have gotten upset and we wouldn't be in this situation?
I think the communication is definitely a part of it. I don't know when you have an organized group like that if they would listen, but I think if they were invited to see what the students were doing, that they might calm down a little bit. So the communication piece is important. And as far as pushback on the project that we were doing, we didn't get any pushback that we were aware of, but we did notice on social media there were some things that showed up that criticized it, and we just sort of ignored that, but it never went any further than just social media. So it was okay, but I could see where in some communities it could. And as we go further with this, that it could also be a problem.
Thanks. Yeah, Robert, what's on your mind?
I wanted to briefly just nod to Fernando's point about values and our conceptions of what schools are for. I mean, I'm kind of professionally closely aligned and identified with Edie Hirsch Jr., who is kind of my guru, as it were, in this work, and he is the core knowledge guy, the cultural literacy guy. So I mean, I'm very much sympathetic to a view of of a knowledge-rich education. So some of these kind of dichotomies melt away for me. In other words, I've been the guy for years standing in that gap, saying, look, knowledge versus skills is a false dichotomy. They need both. But I mean, my critique of Action Civics has tended to focus again on when we take the skills piece out of it, the knowledge piece out of it, and focus just on the skills. Then it just feels like empty calories. I mean, kudos to you, Debbie, the project that you took on. You're absolutely right. Who could possibly object to that? But I think we're being slightly less than candid with ourselves if we don't recognize at least the potential for, look, even in the case study where I mean, am I imagining that there was a value judgment implicit in the student who wanted to do a trans rights project and ended up doing a pro-life project? I mean, I think we, as viewers, we were intended to kind of think, oh, isn't that too bad? That to me suggests a mindset that we are being a little bit less than honest with ourselves if we don't kind of put on the table and recognize our biases there.
Well, I would argue with that maybe wasn't that too bad, but simply because the student had originally picked the idea of transgender athletes And that was I believe the student was an athlete, and that was the topic of interest. But because of the pressure she was feeling from home, she felt like she had to switch. So that's why I would think
I don't want to be.
Go ahead.
I don't want to be cute here, but in other words, in writing this case study, we would never, I mean, those of us who are in this work would never have taken that in the other direction, saying the student really wanted to do something on pro-life, but her parents insisted that she do something on trans rights. That would just not happen.
So let me actually push into this briefly, because we haven't talked about this at all, about our vision of parents' rights, actually. Like, we haven't talked about if there are any dilemmas for parents here or dilemmas for teachers in terms of accommodating their parents' wishes about what their students learn or do in the classroom. And obviously there's a huge amount right now of political activism and conversation about this very question all around the United States. Who wants to? I see a lot of nods. Anybody want to dive in on this?
Who wants to hurl themselves on the grenade?
No, I think that's correct. I mean, I think I'm happy to start. I do think there is in the case disagreement over whether to prioritize the concerns of the parents or of some parents versus the benefits to students or even the desires of the students. And relatedly, there is disagreement over how to weigh the risk of controversy and the time that it would take to resolve it relative to the educational benefits of the approach. In other words, is this a battle worth picking? I suppose that both for Emily herself and for the principal, that is one of the things they have to weigh. In other words, even if they think this is a great program, and they conclude, educating the community, engaging in this dialogue is going to suck up a lot of our time, is the opportunity cost worth it of that? And so I do think there is that dilemma, and that is one of the issues that that Emily and her principal will have to decide. Do we want to bring the community along, or do we ignore it and just think about the students?
I'm now going to pose something. So Fernando had said that he saw the core dilemmas in part as being Emily's trying to judge whether Mr. Walsh is movable, right? And how Mr. Walsh will respond to her actions or to the principal's actions or whatever. Let's posit, and this is following on the sort of the parents' rights movements that we've seen recently. Let's posit that Mr. Walsh is not going to be convinced by outreach from Emily saying, well, let me show you the wide array of projects that we had, et cetera. That Mr. Walsh will keep some of his concerns and will, in fact, continue to organize and potentially bring his organizing beyond just this district to the State House. And, we've seen examples of laws like in Texas, which would actually forbid Robert from having done I'm a little unclear, actually. It may be that the students could have written essays about policy and still be in line with the law, but I don't think that they could say then, for even extra credit, convert their policy paper into a letter that they send to an elected official. Andrew, you're nodding. Is that correct? You're probably the most.
That's correct. Students can simulate democratic processes by writing a policy paper, but couldn't then take the next step and meet with their elected official around that.
So let's say that there is this concern that Mr. Walsh will say, take the Texas legislation language and move it to the state that Emily's school is in. Should Emily push ahead on this Action Civics project that she believes in? Let's say under the ideal conditions that Robert has posited, that there's this really robust, knowledge-rich civic education that the students are also getting. Or in light of this potential political backlash, should she back off?
There's a bit of a tension here that I think we are not recognizing as well. And forgive me if I'm going too far afield here. because I don't have data for this. This is just kind of a gut call based on years of kind of observation and visiting schools and whatnot. I have this sense, and maybe you'll disagree, that the average public school employee in this country simply does not conceive of himself or herself at any given moment as a government agent, as a public employee. In other words, and I think you see some of this tension in the case study, like how are we going to push here? Is it our, who are we aligning with, the parents, the students, etc. In other words, there's almost an assumption of a bit of an oppositional relationship, or at least a tension there. And I'm not pretending to know how to resolve that, but I think it's important to kind of ask ourselves that question: what is our role as educators who are public employees, government funded? What is our obligation to be mindful of the conditions in the community, the spirit of the community, the people, I don't want to be crass about it, who are paying our salaries, so to speak. In other words, there's a conceptual model here in public education. Answer that question for me. Who do we work for question? I mean, I think a lot of the political discussion about this has been overly broad and facile, like parents saying I want control, or teachers saying I don't work for the parents. But we are public employees. We are government, state-sponsored, so to speak, agents, but we don't conceive of ourselves that way. So I think we have to kind of answer that question for ourselves before we can answer these larger dilemmas of who we're accountable to.
Robert, but even if we all agree that teachers in public schools are public employees and accountable to their employers, isn't part of the challenge that the profession also expects of you allegiance to the profession? So let's for a moment assume that we're talking about a medical doctor in a community where everybody loves to smoke. And the medical doctor begins to recommend to their patients, you've got to get away from that. You're going to kill yourself. And the community gets very annoyed. We wouldn't expect that doctor to do anything else than to essentially stand to the Hippocratic principle and say, no, I have a loyalty here to preserving the life of my patients, whether my patient agrees with me or not. So why would it be any different for educators? I mean, we could imagine extreme scenarios where, let's say, for example, that in a community, we had a group of extremists of any sorts, neo-Nazis, radical of any sort, that hijacked the school district, as happened in Birmingham, England, as a matter of fact. And they decided that they're going to use the means of the democratic process to teach a hateful ideology that violates the principles of a democratic society. I would hope the teachers to do the same thing that the doctor would do. The doctor trying to protect the health of the patients to say, I'm sorry, you may have hijacked this system. And in the case of England, Birmingham, that's what they did. They realized that a group of radicals, deeply intolerant individuals had hijacked the public schools, and the state intervened and said, no, that's not acceptable.
Right. I would argue that we have to think about what the role of the public school is. So public schools are not to serve every little small group, splinter group that are maybe very vocal, but are not truly the majority. And they do tend to be well funded, but often the majority. And even in the case study, when they began looking at social media posts, there were posts in support of what was happening. And I think as a public employee, I look at what the standards are of what I'm expected to teach, and I'm always within those. And parents may come in and think that, well, I don't want this. And that's where you have the option to put your child in a private school if you disagree with whatever is being taught, because the public schools are following a curriculum that has been decided. This is what is best for our community. This is what is best for the public that students should know and know how to do. And that's what we do. And sometimes parents are not happy with that. They don't want them to be active citizens unless they're active in the issues that they want them to be active in. And I think it's important for them to understand different points of view. We have such a divided country right now, and it's partially because people don't want to listen to each other and think about things from more than one very narrowly focused viewpoint.
So Debbie, can I just push you on this though? Because what I heard Robert saying was, look, if this law is passed that say outlaws action civics, that is then the public, that is a sort of a representative democracy passing a law that then has implications for the curriculum. And as a teacher, then, we need to follow that. And just as you've said, like, we are teachers who are following a curriculum, that therefore we should go along. I'm curious, like, if this law is passed, do you then just say, all right, well, right, the curriculum has changed and we've had a representative democracy that's changed the curriculum? Or do you, as a teacher, think, no, I actually want to be politically engaged in this?
I think if the law is passed, you have to go with the law. But not to go off on a completely different tangent, but representative democracy is also questionable when you have all the gerrymandering of the districts so that they can pass these laws. But if the law is passed, the law is passed. And so, yeah, as you can't do much as a teacher, I think, if it is in law. But in the case study we looked at, it didn't say anything about a law. So
okay, thanks. Andrew, I want to get to you and then back to you, Robert.
So I think there's in the hypothetical that we're dealing with, a challenge when we throw another piece of information into the equation. And that is the conflict between laws like what we see in Texas, like what's being considered in South Dakota, Wisconsin, Oklahoma, and a number of other places that essentially seek to kind of export a model that would strip away access to action civics, is that there's a conflict between that legislative arc and social studies standards and state constitutions, both of which are calling for ideals of informed, active citizenship. And so it puts teachers, it puts districts in a bit of a conundrum when you have policy signals from the Constitution and from standards saying one thing, and laws which often are unclear as to implementation guidance, how exactly it works out in the classroom, which is being resolved in a number of cases through litigation and court adjudication in a number of state instances. So I think it's important to note that laws of the sort that we're talking about are themselves a civics dilemma, which are currently winding their way throughout respective states. But the second thing that I'd note, if we maybe bracket the question of the legislation for a bit, is that the only way that we can get to students feeling empowered to serve on juries, to vote, to join organizations, and to kind of reverse the bowling alone trend that Robert Putnam, for instance, talks about, is to have schools do the kind of skill acquisition of the analysis and the teamwork capacity that help people to associate with one another skillfully, even in the midst of conflict and dissonance. And I think that's what Action Civics does at its best. And I think that's a part of what, to get another issue on the table in the context of this case, that Diane is pushing for. But social studies is one of the least diverse, racially diverse professions in terms of teacher makeup. And so I think it's noteworthy to point out that there's that potential estrangement in the room and having that conversation.
I'm going to be a little bit puckish here and suggest that within the case study, there is an interesting case study itself. Who is the most effective Action Civics participant or actor in this case study? Well, it's the guy who wrote the op-ed, right? Because he's the guy who provoked a response from a government agency. So we're viewing him as kind of the sand in the gears here, but there'd be an interesting discussion like, well, is this an example of Action Civics? Here's a citizen who was outraged, wrote an op-ed, provoked a response from a government agency, and now we're trying to be like, the oyster with the pearl. We're taking the bit of sand and trying to smooth it over, as opposed to saying, well, wait a minute, isn't this kind of what we're trying to teach our kids to do?
Thanks. That's fascinating. I'm curious. So we've been talking about this case study, the issues around civic education, student civic action, the politics of education, etc., are things that the four of you have each thought and done a lot of work in long and hard for years now. I'm curious, how did working through these issues about civic education through this case study compare to other ways that you've thought about these issues? Fernanda, go for it.
Yeah, I think this case is a very good example of the dilemmas of teaching civic education in democratic societies. And I think that what the case underscores, for me at least, is that education politics, education democratic politics, is and shouldn't be all of democratic politics. In other words, there are things that are fair game in democratic politics that are not fair game in education politics. So in democratic politics, there are all kinds of ways through which people resolve disagreement. Sometimes through deliberate democratic deliberation, not so much these days, sadly, but sometimes through coercion, bribery, or the ruthless exercise of power. And I think that should be absolutely out of bounds in school politics. In school politics, you have no choice if you engage but to engage in democratic deliberation because that is the best way of civic education. So I actually agree with Robert that this individual who wrote the op-ed has to be taken seriously. And even though I said earlier that the dilemma for our protagonist, Emily, is that she doesn't know what his intentions are. She doesn't know, is this just a guy exercising in the democratic game who is open to be persuaded, who is open to entertaining different beliefs? Or is this a guy where no matter what we do, he's out to shut this thing down? But whatever the answer to that question is, if Emily decides to engage, I think she has to engage in good faith, giving the fellow the benefit of the doubt, and seeing this as an opportunity to teach the students and the school community what democratic deliberation is. And to me, that means doing the following things. Number one, she has to understand the situation, understand who are the stakeholders, take the time to listen to the different parties, and understand their interests, including his interest. And a main stakeholder, of course, should be the students. Others should be the teachers, the parents. None of those groups are monolithic, as the case represents, which is why this process takes time. The second thing she has to try to do is reach a negotiated agreement. That's the principle of democracy, right? If one is possible. And that means de escalating the situation by reference to evidence and to scholarship. And so, for example, if there is disagreement on the value of project based learning, educate the community, get them to discuss over the facts, over the evidence. Third, she has to articulate and negotiate the criteria to compare various options. For example, one criterion would be what are the benefits to the kids? What is the feasibility of executing? What are the costs? What are the opportunity costs? What are the political costs? Then she has to brainstorm, not by herself, a range of options and use those criteria to compare them. And then once the decision is reached, of course, she has to build a political map of key stakeholders and try to create a strategy to manage the politics. Notice this is very different from a strategy which I think would be very popular in Congress, where you would say, how do you just demobilize this guy and steamroll him? I think that would be the worst response because it is a school. Might not be the worst response in a different democratic arena, but in a school, you cannot steamroll your opponents. You cannot deny them the right to their point of view. You cannot respond to the ruthless exercise of power with ruthless power, because then you've given up on the democratic missions of the school. You've given up and you've allowed the tyrants to hijack the schools and to teach the lesson that tyranny is all that matters. It's just how much power you have. And I think that's the problem of the moment we're in, a moment of tremendous division where we have lost the most basic habits for democratic deliberation, that the knee-jerk reaction for many of us, the emotional reaction might be, I'm going to shoot down this guy. And I think that educators have to work extra hard in saying, no, if I'm going to engage, it's going to be through democratic dialogue. But as I said earlier, because all of this takes time, the first decision has to be, is this worth it in this case?
Thanks, Fernando. Andrew, I'm curious to hear from you next, given that your job is thinking about policy and advocacy. And I'm curious if thinking about this case has been distinctive in any way for you as compared to how you otherwise think and talk about civic education and engage in civic education advocacy.
Yeah, a number of thoughts come to mind. First, I think this case study is powerful because I think it's humanizing to hear Jim in conversation with Diane, to hear Emily in conversation with Rhonda and Dan, and as both Fernando and Robert have pointed out, to take Mr. Warner's op-ed seriously as itself an exercise of participatory citizenship, an attempt to try to persuade one's fellows. I think comes out through the case in a way that's different than if we were talking through a proposed piece of legislation or reading a 50-state summary by X think tank, let's say. But the second thing that I think is particularly powerful about the case study method is it lifts up the values conflicts and the differential settings of power. And I think that's important to return to again and again in the case. And I say that because I don't fully share Fernando's confidence that schools are deliberative bodies completely unmoored from power, influence, and, trying to hold one sway. I think school board meetings and department meetings and social studies, I think, are probably sufficient evidence of that. However, I think that is unequivocally the ideal of schools. And so I think there's a certain hopefulness about democratic deliberation and about the exchange of views between citizens that I think this case captures powerfully.
Thanks, Andrew. Robert and then Debbie.
Sure. The case, for good or for ill, probably reinforced my priors as much as anything else. What I mean by that is if you want to make the case for Action Civics, and I'm not suggesting we should or should not, it just cannot be a standalone. The example I gave earlier of the kid who was very determined and put together a terrific Action Civics project, but had no concept of how to translate that into government action. So those were kind of my priors walking in, I'm afraid. Those are kind of my priors walking out.
Yeah, as I read the case, I sort of put myself in Emily's position and thought, how would I deal with this? And I think what the conclusion I came to is that I would just want to meet with parents, and I would want to listen to their concerns, and then I would want to try to calm their concerns with just factual evidence and let them see the choices and things like that. I think the way schools are funded is a problem in some places because that controls what school boards are willing to do. I know in Ohio it's all local. And so if the local community is not on board with something, they won't pass the levy, and then you can't operate your school. And I know other states do it statewide. So obviously, concerns of local members of the community are important, but I think that there's a way that you can just kind of help them air their grievances at the same time explain that it's not what you think it is, and that it's going to be a worthwhile activity for their child.
Thanks. If we can end, I'm curious, what do you hope others listening to this conversation will continue to think about?
So what I'm hoping the readers of this case will conclude from it is the same thing I hope they will conclude from reading the whole collection of cases of which this one is a part, which is the value of engaging in deliberation and considering multiple perspectives when thinking about a dilemma. The first thing that anyone in a school setting or any other social setting needs to resolve a dilemma is a theory of mind, an explanation for why others act the way they do. And of course, it would be very naive to project onto others the explanations we have for our own behavior. And so we are inherently limited in our ability to see the world through the eyes of other people. But the beauty of engaging in dilemmas like that is that it helps us practice that perspective taking, particularly if you discuss them. So in this particular case, I would hope that the key participant, the protagonist of the case, would actually write it down in the way in which this case is done and would discuss it with other people before taking any action. Because I think it would lead to a more empathic and, in the end, effective action.
Great, thank you. Robert.
The role of public education preparing young people for active citizenship is both the founding purpose of public education and in many ways the forgotten purpose of public education. So I'm intrigued by this case study and this conversation because it brings us back to that. I'm not comfortable now or ever being the guy who says, do this, don't do that. I don't believe there are right or wrong answers in terms of our approaches, but we have to be kind of, sophisticated in our deliberations about them. So I guess I would advise or hope that anybody who is thinking, okay, well, here's the key to getting kids civically engaged, do it for the right reason. In other words, you need to situate this within a school culture that sees preparation for citizenship as core to its mission and not merely a fun or interesting or engaging activity or one-off.
Thanks, Robert. Debbie.
I think I would like people to take away that the idea of bringing up controversial issues, researching them, learning opposing points of view, figuring out the validity of a source, those are all important life skills. And we can't shield our children from points of view with which we disagree. We need to give them the tools to evaluate, discuss, and even act on these issues that matter to them. And I think that's what Action Civics does.
Thanks. Andrew.
I'd hope that folks reading this case would first see it as a resource with great replay value. I reread it multiple times and found it like peeling an onion to cast issues in sharper relief the more I looked at it. And I hope specifically that folks will have a sense of being inspired to do careful thinking about the stakes of content pedagogy and applying civics in the classroom. I think specifically the relationship between Emily and Dan and Emily and Rhonda illustrates the need to recognize that there's often multiple and competing actions that happen in schools and in communities, and that folks have to be brought along in order to make that ideal a practical one.
Terrific. Thank you so much to all four of you. I really appreciate your contributions to this conversation, and I know that others will find it informative as well.
Thanks to Dr. Meira Levinson, Sarah O'Brien, and the EdEthics team at the Harvard Graduate School of Education for working with us to create this special series. Thanks also to today's panelists, Debbie Holeko, Andrew Wilkes, Robert Pondicio, and Fernando Reimers. And thank you for watching this episode.
You can find separate links to the case video and the discussion video on our website, ethicalschools.org, and on Dr. Levinson's website, justiceinschools.org, where you can also find links to the other cases that Dr. Levinson and her team have created, as well as resources for leading your own discussions about these cases.
We welcome your feedback on this series. Email us and follow us on social media at Ethical Schools. This episode was produced by Hoot Owl Media.